A long time ago, there was a being known as the Sandwalker, and it was known as this because the world it tread upon was naught but sand and sky. It was so dark that you could barely see where your next footfall would land. Until one day, the Sandwalker took a particularly hard step into the sand, and when it pulled its foot away, it noticed that the sand below had been compacted into a dense, warm, glowing mass. And seeing this, it took a lump of sand into its hands and pressed on it, compacted it, and it became a small shimmering ball with the brightness of a small fire. And it did this again until the ball glowed with the brightness of the sun, and then did it again until the brightness of the ball was that to rival 50 suns. But at this point, the sphere could no longer hold itself together and blew apart. And as it did, shining shards of light and sand blew across the landscape. Pleased with this result, the Sandwalker continued to make more of these spheres, and the entire landscape became dotted with glowing, shimmering shards of sand. And as he did this, the Sandwalker noticed that the sand began to change with each new blast. Some forms of sand becoming extremely dense, others being able to float above all the rest of them, even into the sky. And even the colors of the sand began to change. And so, with these new colors and densities, the Sandwalker began to build other spheres, some made solely from one kind or color of sand, others modeled and marbled with all different kinds. And one of these spheres was made particularly of blue and green sand, at least its primaries, and each half was exclusive to that color, blue or green, and it pleased the Sandwalker very much to have this particular sphere. But as the Sandwalker studied it, he began to notice little floating or swimming clumps inside of it. Small little things moving about amongst the blue sand. Not knowing what these were and not wanting to mar its creation, it took this little sphere and plunged it into the coldest cold any individual could subject any object to. And when it pulled it out, the clumps had settled, had disappeared. But as a result, the green and the blue began to intermix and shift and crackle. But after a time, the clumps came back, only different. They were no longer just in the blue sand, but moving across the land in multiple different forms, some even capable of flying with little tiny wings. And seeing these, the Sandwalker was curious, even intrigued. It found the actions of many of these little moving clumps to be quaint or interesting. But then there were the larger clumps, the more aggressive ones. The actions of these displeased the Sandwalker, and it decided that these clumps were to be removed. So, against this little blue and green sphere, it took a small black clump of black sand and ground it across the surface of the sphere until none of the larger lumps remained. And again, the Sandwalker was content. But again, these clumps reappeared, only this time there was a major difference. These clumps, which from this point on we will call the noisy people, actually could fashion sand for themselves, and they were one of the most aggressive of the clumps to ever exist. Not wanting these particular ones to overrun the sphere or to destroy any of the less aggressive ones, and seeing that these particular clumps had no natural defense against the heat or the cold. It lit part of the sphere on fire, and the other part, after a time, it subjected to the same cold it had once subjected it to. But this time, when the Sandwalker pulled the sphere from the cold and the fire, the noisy people still remained. In fact, they seemed to have grown, become more industrious, more resilient. Now this startled the Sandwalker. And so, seeing how these noisy people had become more violent, more aggressive, the Sandwalker set upon looking for more insidious ways of subduing them and of undoing them. First, it convinced many to war against each other simply by what kind of sand they were all made of, by what color of sand they were. Another time, it convinced many that it was a god, and more importantly, that the view that each noisy person had was the only true view, and that all others must convert to this viewpoint or die. And finally, it provided the knowledge of splitting of sands. It told several how the cutting of a single grain of sand could produce enough power to level an entire sphere. And so the Sandwalker waited. Surely their violence and their need to destroy their enemies, their aggression, would undo these noisy people. And so the Sandwalker waited. And finally, nothing. Despite their aggression and violence, the noisy people did not destroy themselves. It seems that they found it was easier to live with their enemies and live another day than to kill their enemies and possibly kill themselves in the process. Stumped, confused, unknowing how to go forward, the Sandwalker set down that blue and green sphere and walked away.